Can the body truly heal itself simply by changing what you put on your plate? At 95 years old, I no longer speak in theories. I speak in outcomes. I have buried friends who were stronger than me, richer than me, and far more educated than me. Yet here I am, still walking, still thinking clearly, still waking up each morning without the weight of pills defining my day. And if you ask me what shifted the trajectory of my life, I will tell you plainly. I stopped fighting my body and started feeding it what it was designed to use. For most of my life, I believed what many still believe, that the body breaks down with age, that illness is inevitable, and that medicine is the primary path to survival. But over time, I began to notice something unsettling. The more we tried to control disease from the outside, the less we seemed to understand what was happening on the inside. We were treating symptoms, but we were not changing the environment that created them. That realization changed everything. You see, the human body is not passive. It is not waiting to be fixed. It is constantly repairing, regulating, and adapting. Every second, your cells are either moving toward balance or away from it. And what determines that direction more than anything else is not your genetics, not your age, but the biochemical environment you create through your daily habits, especially what you eat. When I began shifting toward a plant-based way of eating, I did not expect miracles. I was not chasing some grand promise of instant healing. I was simply curious. Could giving my body cleaner, more nutrient-dense foods reduce the burden it carried every day? Could it lower the quiet inflammation I didn't even know I had? Could it support the systems that had been working for me all along without my help? The answer did not come in a flash. It came gradually. My digestion changed first, lighter, more predictable. Then my energy stabilized. I no longer felt the sharp rises and crashes that had once defined my afternoons. Over time, even the small aches I had accepted as normal aging began to fade into the background. What I discovered was not that food heals in some magical sense. It is more precise than that. The right foods remove obstacles. They reduce the noise in the system. They allow the body to do what it has always known how to do: repair, restore, and rebalance. A plant-based diet, rich in fiber, antioxidants, and natural compounds, does something quietly powerful. It lowers oxidative stress. It calms inflammation. It feeds the microbiome, the vast internal ecosystem that influences everything from immunity to mood. And when those systems begin to function properly, something remarkable happens. The body starts working with you instead of against you. But let me be clear, this is not a promise of curing every disease. That is where many people misunderstand. Healing is not a switch you flip. It is a process you support. And that process depends on consistency, patience, and respect for the complexity of your own biology. So the real question is not whether a plant-based diet can heal you. The real question is this: are you willing to give your body the conditions it needs and then allow it the time to respond? If you are, then what I am about to share may change the way you see food and your health for the rest of your life. I did not arrive at this understanding overnight. In fact, for decades, I lived in quiet contradiction, doing what I believed was normal, while my body slowly tried to compensate for choices it was never designed to handle. In my younger years, food was convenience, pleasure, and habit. Meat at the center of every meal, processed snacks in between, sugar as a reward, salt as enhancement. It was not reckless, it was typical. And that is precisely the problem. What is typical is not always what is optimal. What is common is not always what the body can sustain over time. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The human body is remarkably adaptive. It absorbs stress, buffers imbalance, and continues functioning long after the first warning signs appear. But adaptation is not the same as health. It is survival, and survival has a cost. By my late 50s and into my 60s, the cost began to show. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly. My energy became less stable, my digestion less predictable. My weight fluctuated despite no major change in how much I ate. Blood pressure crept upward. Sleep became lighter, more fragmented. These were not crises, they were whispers. But whispers, if ignored long enough, become declarations. What troubled me most was how these changes were explained. It's age, they said. It's normal. And so, like many, I accepted decline as an unavoidable trajectory. But something in me resisted that idea. I had seen people age differently. Some declined rapidly. Others remained sharp, mobile, and resilient well into their later years. The difference, I suspected, was not luck alone. It was environment, internal environment. You must understand this clearly. Every system in your body responds to the conditions you create. Your bloodstream is not just a transport system. It is a communication network. What you eat alters that network. It changes hormone signaling, immune responses, metabolic pathways. It determines whether your body exists in a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation or in a state that supports repair. When I began studying this more seriously, not casually but with intent, I encountered a consistent pattern. Diets centered around whole plant foods, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds were associated with lower rates of chronic disease. That alone was not surprising. What was more compelling was why. Let us speak in biological terms. First, inflammation. Chronic inflammation is not like the swelling you see after an injury. It is silent, systemic, and persistent. It interferes with cellular signaling, damages tissues over time, and is implicated in conditions ranging from heart disease to diabetes to cognitive decline. Diets high in processed foods, saturated fats, and refined sugars tend to promote this inflammatory state. In contrast, plant-based foods are rich in anti-inflammatory compounds, polyphenols, flavonoids, carotenoids. These are not nutrients in the traditional sense. They are signaling molecules. They interact with your cells, influencing gene expression, reducing oxidative stress, and modulating immune activity. Second, the gut microbiome. When I was young, no one spoke about it. Today, we understand that trillions of microorganisms live within the digestive tract, forming an ecosystem that directly impacts digestion, immunity, even mental health. And what feeds this ecosystem? Fiber, not animal protein, not processed carbohydrates stripped of structure. Fiber, found almost exclusively in plant foods. When you consume a diet rich in diverse plant fibers, you're not just feeding yourself. You're feeding the bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids, compounds that reduce inflammation, strengthen the gut lining, and improve metabolic health. When that system functions well, the effects ripple outward throughout the entire body. Third, metabolic efficiency. The body is constantly managing energy, storing it, using it, balancing it. Diets high in refined foods tend to create sharp spikes in blood sugar, followed by crashes. Over time, This stresses the system, leading to insulin resistance, a key driver of type 2 diabetes and other metabolic disorders. Whole plant foods, by contrast, are structurally intact. Their fiber slows digestion, leading to more stable glucose levels. This reduces the burden on the pancreas and helps maintain insulin sensitivity over time. Now, I did not know all of this when I began, but I experienced the outcomes before I understood the mechanisms. And that is often how truth reveals itself, first through results, then through explanation. When I gradually shifted my diet, emphasis on gradually, I noticed something important. My body did not resist the change. It responded to it. Within weeks, my digestion improved. I felt lighter, not in weight alone, but in function. Meals no longer left me sluggish. Instead, they seemed to support sustained energy. My cravings changed, not because I forced them to, but because my internal chemistry shifted. Within months, my blood markers began to reflect these changes. Cholesterol levels improved. Blood pressure stabilized. My physician, who had expected the usual progression of age-related issues, began asking questions. But perhaps the most profound change was less measurable. It was the sense that my body was no longer under constant strain. That something, deep within the system, had been relieved of a burden. This is what people misunderstand when they hear the phrase healing through diet. It is not that food acts as medicine in the way a drug does, targeting a specific pathway with immediate effect. It is that food shapes the environment in which all biological processes occur. If the environment is hostile, pro-inflammatory, nutrient-poor, metabolically chaotic, then even the most advanced medical interventions face limitations. But if the environment supports balance, then the body's inherent repair mechanisms can operate more effectively. That is the distinction. Now, let us address the skepticism, because it is valid. Can a plant-based diet reverse every disease? No. Can it replace all forms of medical treatment? No. Can it on its own guarantee longevity? Again, no. But that is the wrong framework. The question is not whether diet is a cure-all. The question is whether it is foundational. And the answer, based on both evidence and lived experience, is yes. You cannot build health on a compromised foundation. You cannot expect the body to repair itself efficiently while continuously introducing elements that disrupt its function. This is not a moral argument. It is a biological one. Over time, I came to see food not as entertainment, not as comfort, but as information. Every meal sends signals. It tells your body whether to store or release, to inflame or to calm, to repair or to defend. And when you begin to align those signals, consistently, not perfectly, you create a condition in which healing becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. There is another aspect that must be understood: patience. We live in a time that values speed, quick results, immediate feedback, rapid transformation. But the body does not operate on that timeline. The conditions that lead to chronic disease often develop over years, even decades. It is unreasonable to expect reversal in days or weeks. What you are doing when you adopt a more supportive way of eating is not forcing change. You are removing interference. You are allowing processes that were suppressed to resume. That takes time. In my case, the most meaningful changes unfolded over years, not months, but they were stable, they were sustainable, and they were not dependent on constant intervention. At 95, I do not rely on willpower to maintain this way of eating. It is no longer a strategy. It is my baseline. And that, perhaps, is the most important shift of all. Because when something becomes your baseline, it no longer feels like effort. It feels like alignment. You are not constantly resisting temptation. You are not negotiating with yourself at every meal. You are simply living in a way that supports the system you inhabit. And when that happens, something quiet but profound emerges. Your body stops asking for rescue and starts demonstrating resilience. In the next part, I'll speak more directly about the practical side, what this way of eating actually looks like, the mistakes I made along the way, and the principles that made it sustainable over decades, not just months. Because understanding is important, but application is where everything changes. Understanding gave me direction, but it was application, imperfect, slow, sometimes frustrating, that gave me results. If you're expecting a rigid system, a strict list of rules, or a perfect diet that must be followed without deviation, you'll be disappointed. That was one of my earliest mistakes. I believed that if something was good, then doing it perfectly would be better. But the body does not respond well to extremes sustained by force. It responds to consistency supported by understanding. So let me tell you what this actually looked like in my life, not as theory, but as lived practice. I did not wake up one morning and eliminate everything at once. I began with observation. I paid attention to how I felt after meals, not just immediately, but hours later. Was my energy stable? Was my mind clear? Was my digestion calm or strained? These signals became my guide. The first shift I made was not dramatic. I simply increased the proportion of plant foods on my plate. More vegetables, more whole grains, more legumes. I did not remove meat entirely at the beginning. I displaced it. And that distinction matters. When you focus on adding what supports the body, rather than obsessing over what to remove, the transition becomes less confrontational. Over time, something interesting happened. As the nutrient density of my meals increased, my appetite began to regulate itself. I was no longer driven by the same intensity of cravings. This is not a matter of discipline, it is a matter of biology. When the body receives what it needs, it stops signaling urgency. Eventually, reducing animal products became easier, not because I forced it, but because my body no longer relied on them in the same way. My meals became simpler, but also more functional. A typical day, even now, is structured around whole foods in their natural form. In the morning, I eat fruit, sometimes alone, sometimes with oats or a handful of nuts. It is light, but it provides hydration, fiber, and micronutrients that support the system after a night of fasting. Midday, I shift to something more substantial. Legumes, lentils, beans, combined with whole grains like brown rice or quinoa, accompanied by a variety of vegetables. Not one or two, but several. Diversity is important. Different plant foods provide different compounds, and the body benefits from that range. In the evening, I eat less. Not because I am restricting, but because my body does not require as much energy late in the day. A lighter meal supports better sleep, and better sleep supports everything else. There's nothing exotic in this. No expensive ingredients, no complicated preparation. The power is not in complexity. It is in consistency. Now, let me address a critical point: nutritional adequacy. One of the most common concerns about plant-based diets is whether they provide sufficient protein, vitamins, and minerals. This concern is not without basis, but it is often misunderstood. Protein, for example, is rarely deficient when caloric intake is adequate and food variety is maintained. Legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds all contribute. The issue is not absence, it is distribution and awareness. Micronutrients require more attention. Vitamin B12 in particular is not reliably available in plant foods. This is not a failure of the diet. It is a reflection of modern food systems. I supplement B12. I do so without hesitation because the goal is not ideology. The goal is function. Omega-3 fatty acids, iodine, and vitamin D are also worth monitoring, depending on your environment and food choices. This is where understanding replaces assumption. A well-structured plant-based diet is not deficient. It is deliberate. Another mistake I made early on was assuming that all plant foods are equally beneficial. They are not. Highly processed plant products, refined sugars, white flour, industrial oils can create many of the same problems as the diets I moved away from. Simply removing animal products does not guarantee improvement. The quality of what replaces them matters. Whole, minimally processed foods form the foundation. That is the principle that guided me. There were also social challenges. Food is not only biological, it is cultural, emotional, relational. Changing how you eat can create friction, especially in environments where shared meals are central to connection. I learned not to impose my choices on others. I adapted quietly. I brought my own dishes when necessary. I focused on what I could control rather than what I could not. Over time, the resistance I anticipated rarely materialized. People are less concerned with what you eat than you might think. And when they did ask, I did not preach. I spoke from experience. That is enough. Now let us return to the concept of healing, because this is where clarity is essential. What I experienced was not a sudden reversal of all physical decline. I still aged. I still encountered limitations. But the trajectory changed. Instead of accumulating dysfunction, I stabilized. In some areas, I improved. My cardiovascular markers remained within healthy ranges. My cognitive function stayed sharp. I maintained mobility longer than many of my peers. These are not miracles. They are outcomes of sustained alignment between input and biology. There is a principle I want you to understand deeply. The body is always responding. It is never idle. Even when you feel nothing, processes are unfolding, cells regenerating, systems recalibrating, damage being repaired or accumulated. What you eat influences those processes continuously, not occasionally, not only when you make a healthy choice. Every meal contributes. That's why consistency matters more than intensity. You don't need a perfect week followed by a collapse into old habits. You need a pattern that you can sustain. A pattern that reduces internal stress, supports metabolic stability, and provides the raw materials your body requires. And this brings me to something many overlook: the absence of harm. Much of what we call healing is simply the body recovering once the sources of damage are reduced. If you stop exposing the system to constant inflammatory triggers, it begins to recalibrate. If you reduce metabolic overload, energy systems stabilize. If you nourish the microbiome, digestion and immunity improve. You're not forcing the body to do something new. You are allowing it to return to what it is designed to do. But this only works if you give it time. There is no precise timeline I can offer you. It depends on your starting point, your consistency, your overall lifestyle. Sleep, movement, stress, all of these interact with diet. You cannot isolate one factor completely from the others. What I can tell you is this: the earlier you begin, the greater the long-term effect. But even later in life, change is possible. I began in earnest when many would consider it too late, yet the body responded. That alone should challenge the belief that decline is fixed. Let me also address weight, because it often becomes the focus. Yes, my weight stabilized over time, but that was not the goal. It was a byproduct. When metabolic systems function properly, weight tends to regulate within a healthier range. But chasing weight alone without addressing underlying processes is often ineffective. Focus on function, not appearance. The latter follows the former. There were moments when I questioned whether the effort was worth it, when results were slow, when convenience tempted me back toward old habits. But I reminded myself of something simple. Every choice is a vote for the environment within your body. You are not deciding your health in a single moment. You are shaping it over time. And that perspective removes pressure. It replaces urgency with direction. Now, after decades of living this way, I no longer think in terms of restriction or discipline. I think in terms of alignment. Does this choice support the systems that keep me alive and functional? If the answer is yes, it becomes the default. That is the shift I want you to consider. Not a temporary change, not a short-term experiment, but a reorientation of how you relate to food. Because once you understand that food is not just fuel, but information, signals that influence every level of your biology, you begin to see each meal differently, not as an obligation, not as a reward, but as an opportunity to either support or undermine the most complex system you will ever inhabit. In the final part, I will leave you with what matters most, not more information, but the distilled principles that have allowed me to reach this age with clarity, function, and a sense of internal stability that I did not have in my earlier years. Because in the end, complexity must become simplicity. Otherwise, it is not sustainable. If you have followed me this far, then you already understand something most people overlook. The body is not your enemy. It is not failing you. It is responding to you. At 95 years old, that is the clearest truth I can offer. All the complexity we discussed, nutrients, inflammation, metabolism, microbiome, can be reduced to a single principle. The environment you create inside your body determines how well it can function, repair, and endure over time. And food is one of the most powerful tools you have to shape that environment. A plant-based diet, when built on whole, unprocessed foods, does not heal in the way people often imagine. It does not override biology or erase every condition. What it does is more fundamental. It removes interference. It reduces the constant strain placed on your systems. It supplies the raw materials your body needs. And in doing so, it allows processes that were already there, quiet, intelligent, continuous, to operate more effectively. That is what natural healing truly is. Not a miracle, not a shortcut. A return to conditions where the body can do its work. But this only matters if it becomes something you live, not something you try for a few weeks and abandon. Consistency is where the effect compounds. Small, repeated decisions, day after day, shape outcomes that no single action ever could. You do not need perfection. I never had it. What you need is direction. Choose foods that are closer to their natural state. Increase variety, different vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes. Pay attention to how your body responds, not just immediately, but over time. Support the system with sleep, with movement, with moments of rest. These are not separate from diet. They are part of the same equation. And most importantly, be patient. The body does not operate on urgency. It operates on continuity. What you build slowly is what lasts. If you are waiting for certainty, proof that this will solve everything, you will wait forever. That is not how life works. But if you are willing to test it, to observe, to adjust, then you will begin to see something change. Not all at once, but steadily. Your energy may stabilize. Your digestion may improve. Your mind may feel clearer. These are not small things. They are signals that the system is shifting. And from there, larger changes become possible. So when you ask, can a plant-based diet help heal the body naturally? The most honest answer I can give you is this. It can create the conditions in which healing becomes possible. What happens next depends on how consistently you maintain those conditions and how long you allow them to work. At my age, I no longer look for quick solutions. I look for what endures. And what has endured for me is not a specific rule or a rigid system, but a simple alignment. Give the body what it needs. Stop giving it what it struggles to handle. Then step back and let it do what it was designed to do. That is the quiet power most people spend their lives overlooking. You do not have to.